The Empire laughed at humanity. Humans laughed, until the Empire stopped existing. The tally concluded at 9,112 to 4, and with a single heavy clack of an amber ledger stone, Earth ceased to be a sovereign world. The brass weight hit the resonance plate with a flat, dry thud. Prime Numerator Vienzal did not look down at the human delegation when he did it. The broad, chitin-plated ridges of his face remained perfectly still, his flat mandibles tucked into the smooth, gray bone of his jaw. He simply pulled his three-fingered hand back into the folds of his formal weave, leaving the stone where it lay. In the high tiers of the celestial quorum, 3,000 delegates from the core systems shifted their weight, their scales and heavy robes creating a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping across stone. Humanity was now inventory. The law was recorded, the ledger locked, and the mandate issued for the immediate kinetic boarding of Earth's Cradle 9 Seed Vault Ark. Director Kell sat at the small iron table on the floor of the chamber. His console did not flash. It did not beep. The green light on his microphone simply died, the power cut from the high podium before his lips could form the first word of his formal objection. He didn't pound the table. He didn't look up at the 3-meter height of the prime numerator. His hand stayed flat on the dark metal surface, his thumb lightly pressing against the side of an iridium drafting compass. The metal was cool against his skin. Around him, the chamber smelled of old sulfur and the sharp, chemical bite of ion-filtered air. The Velorox did not use heat, they used pressure. The air in the lower tiers always felt thin, a subtle reminder to younger races that they were breathing by permission. A ledger does not ask the ink for permission, Vienzal said. His voice was a low, vibrational hum that rattled the glass water carafes on the lower tables. He did not use the amplifiers. He did not need them. The file on your species has been closed. Your assets are reassigned to the central core. The boarding groups have already launched. Kell looked down at his compass. He opened the legs 3 millimeters, then closed them until the steel point touched his thumbnail. He didn't look back at the high tiers where the delegates were already standing, their long, multi-jointed arms gathered in gestures of dismissal. The human delegation consisted of 3 people: Kell, a junior scribe named Jace, and a logistics officer whose hands were trembling against her knees. When the quorum laughed, they did not realize they had just started a timer on their own extinction. Would you have stayed, or would you have run? Because Kell didn't run. He stood up slowly. He did not look at the high podium where Vienzal was already turning his back, his heavy chitinous shoulders shifting under his silver mantle. Kell tucked the iridium compass into his vest pocket, smoothed the front of his dark wool coat, and walked toward the high obsidian doors at the back of the chamber. His boots made no sound on the heavy carpets. The junior scribe followed 2 steps behind, holding an empty leather case like a shield. Outside, the sky above Tavan Prime was a deep, bruised purple, torn by the high-altitude methane storms that gave the planet its color. The transit platform was cold. "Director," Jace whispered, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "The Ark. They're going to breach the outer ring within 12 hours. The seed vault isn't protected." "The Ark is where we left it," Kell said. His voice was level, completely stripped of the heat that usually followed a council ruling. He pulled his collar up against the wind. "Get the shuttle ready. We are going dark." 4 hours later, the communication arrays at Deep Hanker Command on Earth went silent. They didn't send a protest. They didn't call the regional supervisors. Every light on the transit grid simply shifted from blue to gray, signaling an unmonitored maintenance hold. For 96 consecutive hours, the diplomatic channels broadcast nothing but the steady, low hiss of cosmic background radiation. High above the atmosphere, the Velorox boarding vessels moved with the heavy, unhurried precision of apex predators. They were massive things, blocky, black iron wedges that didn't use shields because nothing in the outer sectors possessed the kinetic force to scratch their hull alloy. Commander Trackvel stood on the bridge of the lead wedge. his optical stalks twitching as the image of the Cradle 9 Ark filled the main view screen. The human Ark was an old design, a long, white cylinder built from modular steel panels and primitive foam insulation. It looked like a bone floating in the dark. "The boarding teeth are set," the first mate reported. His mandibles clicked twice, a sign of casual anticipation. "The hull is soft, no defense grid active, no power spikes detected in the core." "They are an industrial race," Trackvell said, his voice grating like stone on gravel. He adjusted the heavy leather strap across his chest. "They understand numbers. When the ledger stone hits the plate, they know the argument is finished. Fire the teeth." 4 massive steel harpoons tore from the belly of the iron wedge, trailing thick woven cables. They hit the white side of the Cradle 9 Ark with a sound that didn't travel through the vacuum but vibrated hard through the hulls of the boarding ships. The white panels buckled. The teeth bit deep, locking into the structural ribs of the human ship. The boarding parties moved through the tubes within 3 minutes, their heavy boots clattering against the interior bulkheads of the Ark. They carried heavy plasma torches, ready to cut through the security bulkheads of the genetic vaults. They expected to find lines of human technicians holding kinetic rifles behind makeshift barricades. They expected the smell of fear. Instead, they found nothing. The air inside the main corridor was cold, so cold that the moisture from the boarding suits froze instantly into fine white frost on their visors. The lights were on, but they were set to a dim, amber low-power mode. Trackvell walked through the secondary airlock, his heavy hand resting on the hilt of his sidearm. He stopped. The corridor was clear. Every locker was open. Every data terminal had been unscrewed from the bulkheads, leaving nothing but clean copper wires hanging from the holes like dead vines. "Commander," a soldier called from the central vault, "the vault doors are open." Trackvell moved down the line, his heavy boots leaving deep gray smudges on the white floor. He stepped into the core chamber where the frozen genetic legacy of Earth was supposed to be stored in triple-walled stasis fields. The racks were gone. The floor was a smooth, empty circle of gray iron. In the exact center of the room, sitting on a small wooden crate that had been left behind, was a single piece of white paper. It wasn't an electronic slate. It was paper, primitive, cheap wood pulp. Trackvell picked it up with 2 fingers. His translation visor hummed for a second, decoding the small, neat ink characters written in the center of the page. 62, it read. He stared at it. His mandibles parted slightly, but no sound came out. He looked at the empty walls, the clean copper leads, the absence of a single human body. The humans hadn't fled in panic when the vote passed. They had already been gone before the ledger stone hit the resonance plate. They had cleared the entire facility, millions of tons of equipment, thousands of stasis pods, the entire biological history of their world, and they had done it in absolute silence. "Where are the tracking files?" Trackvell barked, turning on his first mate. "The subspace anomalies. A ship this size cannot move without leaving an ion trail." "There is no trail, sir," the first mate said, his optical stalks flattening against his skull. "The scanners show nothing. The quorum file says they use standard chemical thrusters. They shouldn't be able to drop off the local net." "The file is 40 years old," Trackvell whispered. He looked down at the paper in his hand. The wood pulp felt strangely heavy. 2,000 light-years away, in the dark space behind the Cinder Ring foundries, Director Kell sat in the high-backed captain's chair of Deep Anchor Command. The room was dark, lit only by the faint orange glow of 62 separate tactical displays. The only sound was the rhythmic, steady tap, tap, tap of his iridium drafting compass against his palm. "They've entered the empty hull," the logistics officer said from the lower well. Her voice was steady now, the trembling gone, replaced by the cold, mechanical rhythm of a technician who had practiced her steps 1,000 times. "The Velorox boarding team has confirmed breach of Cradle 9. Kell did not look up from his main terminal. Initiate the dust protocol. Fleets are in position, she replied. Her fingers moved across the glass panel without a single error. Phase-shifted arrays are fully stable. The local inspectors are still asleep in their sector stations. Kel turned the compass over in his hand, looking at the fine silver lines etched into its side. We gave them 96 hours to look at their charts, he said softly. They spent it looking at their ledgers instead. In the high orbit above Taven Prime, inside the white marble spires of the Prime Numerator's private estate, the air smelled of imported orchid oil and damp earth. Prime Numerator Vienzal sat before a large desk carved from a single slab of black obsidian. He was reviewing the new labor quotas for the outer territories, his long finger tracing the figures on a glowing amber slate. The file was perfect. It showed the human population neatly divided into production units, their resource intake reduced by 40% under the new classification law. The ledger stone sat at the corner of his desk, its polished orange surface reflecting the soft light of the room. His terminal chimed. It wasn't the high, sharp alert of a military warning. It was a low, rhythmic pulse, the sound of an incoming commercial transit receipt. Vienzal did not look up. He touched the edge of the slate to dismiss it. The terminal chimed again, then 3 times more in rapid succession. He paused, his optical stalks rising from his brow as he looked at the secondary display. A small green line of text was scrolling across the bottom of the screen, updating with the speed of an automated logistics terminal at a major port. Transit Pod 1 secure. Transit Pod 2 secure. Transit Pod 3 secure. The numbers kept climbing, flashing green against the dark glass. Vienzal frowned, his mandibles tightening into a thin line. He touched the interface, pulling the source data from the subspace link. The signal wasn't coming from the frontier. It was coming from the Cinder Ring, the massive 5,000-mile circle of orbital foundries that produced 90% of the Velorock's military fleet. He cleared his throat, a low, rasping sound. "Get me the sector overseer at Foundry 12, he commanded the room's automated receiver. The system hummed. The connection didn't form. Instead, another line of green text flickered onto his main slate, overriding his quota files. Transit Pod 114, secure. Laborer evacuation complete. Vienzal stood up, his great height cast in long, jagged shadows against the white walls of his office. He reached out and picked up the amber ledger stone, his fingers tightening around the cold quartz until his knuckles turned white beneath the chitin. "Overseer," he called out again, his voice rising into the mid-register for the first time in 10 years. "Answer the line." The screen did not show a face. It showed a map of the Cinder Ring, and every single foundry block was beginning to flash with a strange, pale blue light that his system had no name for. The pale blue light on Vienzal's display did not blink. It remained solid, a cold circle of neon that seemed to sap the warmth from the obsidian room. He touched the glass plate with his thumb, attempting to pull up the personnel roster for Foundry 12. The screen did not clear. The automated green line continued its slow, mechanical crawl across the bottom of the casing, updating the count with an unhurried rhythm that felt like a pulse. Transit Pod 240, secure. Laborer evacuation complete. Vienzal lowered his head, his multi-jointed neck joints clicking under his heavy collar. The sector files were clear. The human baseline was primitive. According to the Central Archive registries, Earth's defensive assets consisted of low-velocity kinetic platforms and sublight transport hulls that required 3 weeks to cross a single system. They were a client species, lacking the deep-bore mining tech required to harvest heavy core elements. They were labor stock, meant to be managed, counted, and filed away. Yet the receipts in front of him were coming through the encrypted Quorum military network, a network that used localized phase keying that should have been invisible to any race outside the three founding lineages. He walked to the high balcony, his claws digging into the polished marble floor. Below his estate, the capital city stretched across the rim of the Great Canyon, its millions of crystalline spires glowing with the amber light of the planet's primary moon. The air was perfectly still. On the horizon, the massive dark silhouette of the Cinder Ring was visible against the violet storm clouds, a solid line of metal that held 62 distinct shipyard arrays. It was the largest industrial installation in the known sectors. No fleet had ever approached it without triggering the core sensors 3 days out. "Connect me to the defensive picket," Vienzal said, his voice flat, his mandibles barely parting. The room's receiver remained silent for 3 seconds. Then, instead of the sector commander's voice, a dry electronic click echoed from the wall panel. A level human voice broke through the speaker, clear, unhurried, and entirely free of panic. "This is Deep Anchor Command," the voice said. It was the logistics officer from Kell's delegation. She did not sound like an insurgent. She sounded like a port clerk reading a cargo list. "All civilian transit pods have reached the neutral grid boundaries. The core sectors are now clear of non-combatant personnel." Vienzal did not answer the machine. He reached down and picked up his communication slate, forcing an override code through his personal seal. "Picket leader, report. Identify the subspace bleed in the lower ring." The screen flickered. The face that appeared was not the picket leader. It was Director Aris Kell. The human director was still sitting in his high-backed chair, his dark coat unbuttoned at the neck. The iron table before him was clear except for the small silver drafting compass. He was not looking at the screen. He was using a small piece of cloth to clean the steel point of the tool, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate precision that made the silence between them stretch like a wire. "Your ledger is very old, Prime Numerator," Kell said softly. He did not look up from his work. "You look at the files we let your inspectors sign 40 years ago, and you believe you are looking at a house. You don't look at the foundation. You are executing an unauthorized labor relocation," Vienzal said, his shoulder plates rising in a gesture of absolute legal authority. "The quorum has already authorized the reclamation of your world. Your assets are sovereign property of the Corps. If your ships do not power down their arrays within 5 minutes, the defensive picket will reduce your arc to scrap." Kell stopped cleaning the compass. He set the cloth down on the metal table, aligned it parallel to the edge, and finally raised his eyes to the terminal. His expression was empty. There was no hatred in his face, no triumph, no anger. There was only the cold, flat certainty of a mathematician who had already run the numbers to the final line. "The arc is already empty, Prime Numerator," Kell said. "Your boarding team is standing in a hollow shell. They are currently looking at a piece of paper that contains the number 62. I believe Commander Trackvel is trying to figure out what it means." Vienzal's upper mandible twitched. He touched his personal console, switching the feed to the Cradle 9 sector. The tactical telemetry showed the black wedges of his boarding ship still locked onto the white cylinder, but the sensor grid was no longer reading the human hull as solid matter. The white lines on the display were beginning to waver, softening at the edges like salt dissolving in water. "What is that?" Vienzal whispered. "We didn't spend the last 40 years building bigger ships," Kell said, his voice dropping into a level register that carried no weight at all. "Bigger ships just give your scribes more numbers to write down in their stones. We spent our time studying your alloys, the material you use to build your spires, your foundries, your weapons, the silver iron weave that makes your empire possible." On the balcony, Vienzal looked up at the sky. The solid line of the Cinder Ring was still there, a dark band against the stars. But as he watched, the far western edge of the ring, the section that housed the prime foundries, seemed to lose its shine. The brilliant white lights of the shipyards did not turn off. They simply changed color, shifting from a bright, hard blue to a soft, dull orange that looked like cooling embers. "The physics are very simple," Kell's voice continued from the speaker. Every metal has a memory. If you change the frequency of the space around it, the memory clears. The molecules forget how to hold onto each other. Vienzal turned back to the terminal, his hand slamming down on the obsidian desk with a force that cracked the outer veneer. You have no kinetic arrays in that sector. Our scouts checked every moon within 3 sectors. There are no human vessels within firing range. We don't need to fire, Prime Numerator, Kell said. He picked up his drafting compass, set the point against his desk, and drew a slow, perfect circle in the wood. We are already there. We have been there for 3 hours. The screen did not go dark. It did not lose connection. But the image of Director Kell began to pull away, his face breaking into 1,000 tiny green pixels that didn't disappear. They simply drifted across the glass like sand blown by a desert wind. High above the capital, the western foundries began to vibrate. The sound did not cross the vacuum of space, but the structural foundations of the spires on the planet below began to hum, a deep, subvocal rattle that made every water carafe in the valley ring like a bell. Vienzal stepped back onto the balcony, his optical stalk straining against the glare of the primary moon. The far edge of the cinder ring was no longer a solid line. It was widening, thickening into a vast, gray cloud that was slowly spreading along the orbital arc. The Empire's industrial heart was not burning. It was not exploding. It was turning into snow. The central shipyard of Foundry 12 did not tear apart with a flash of light. It did not snap under the strain of an explosion. The 3,000-meter lattice of reinforced silver iron simply became soft. The massive docking arms, which had held the pride of the core fleet since the last territorial consolidation, began to lean sideways like tallow left too close to a furnace. The transition was silent, uniform, and absolute. Vienzal stood on his marble balcony, his hand still clamped around the amber ledger stone. The cold quartz of the artifact was smooth against his palm, but the sky it reflected was changing color. Along the entire 5,000-mile curve of the cinder ring, the brilliant white pinpricks of industrial power were dying out, replaced by a massive, silent smear of charcoal gray that seemed to absorb the light of the stars. "Report," Vienzal said. He did not turn back toward the office terminal. His voice had dropped into a register so low that his chest plates vibrated against his silk tunic. "Get me the structural readings from the core ring." The system did not answer with text. It did not show a data chart. The communication unit on his desk gave a single, wet click, and then a series of automated safety alerts began to chime from the lower tiers of the estate. They were the old mechanical bells, the ones designed to ring only when the main power grid suffered a total systemic collapse. "The picket line is gone, Prime Numerator," the voice of his first mate came through a hand-held slate. The audio was thick with static, the frequency shifting as the local magnetic fields began to unravel. "They didn't fire on us. They didn't pass through our sensors. The hull plating on the lead wedges, it's just falling off. The rivets are turning to sand." Vienzal's fingers tightened until the edges of the amber stone bit into the soft skin between his chitinous plates. "Order the boarding teams on the human ark to return. Tell them to bring the vessel into the central slipway immediately." "There is no slipway, sir," the first mate whispered. The sound of shifting metal was audible behind his words, a dry, grating slide like gravel pouring down a chute. "The berths are gone. The foundries are gone. Everything we built in the upper arc is just drifting." On the view screen inside the dark office, the green line of the human logistics terminal was still moving. It had stopped counting the transit pods. The receipts were done. The 3.8 million workers were already clear, their automated pods drifting toward the neutral zone borders on pre-calculated trajectories that the Quorum's defense grids had no power to intercept. The screen now displayed a single, static image, a top-down schematic of the Celestial Quorum's central amphitheater. Kell had not disconnected the line. He had simply changed the layout. Vian Zhao walked back into the room, his long robes dragging across the marble floor. He set the amber ledger stone on the center of his black desk, directly over the image of the chamber floor where Kel had sat 4 hours before. The human director's seat was empty now on the display, but a small text box had appeared beside the icon for the iron table. The ledger is 40 years old, the text read. The ink is dry, the math is finished. We have 300,000 soldiers in the lower barracks, Vian Zhao said to the empty room. He was speaking to himself now, his mandibles clicking in the rapid, irregular pattern of a clerk whose totals would not balance. The core fleets are still intact at the secondary anchor. We have the numbers. We have the sovereignty mandate. He reached for the slate to call the Grand General of the numeric block, but before his fingers could touch the glass, the lights in his office went out. The darkness was not total. The methane storms of Tavan Prime still cast a dull, purple glow through the high glass windows, but the luxury of the estate, the ion-filtered light, the glowing amber panels, the humming climate grids, simply ceased to be. The air grew cold within 10 seconds, the metallic smell of recycled coolant replaced by the raw, sulfurous draft from the ventilation shafts below. From the city below the canyon, a sound rose. It was not the sound of panic or shouting. It was the collective, low groan of millions of automated machines shutting down at the same time. The transport grids died. The light towers flickered once, turned a deep, rusty orange, and then dissolved into the dark. Vian Zhao looked down at his desk. The terminal screen was dark, but the image of the quorum floor was still visible, etched into the glass by some residual charge in the phosphors. The door to his office did not click open. The heavy stone slab simply slid back into its recess, moved by some manual counterweight that had not been used since the spires were built. A single figure stood in the corridor outside. It wasn't a soldier. It wasn't a human boarding party with kinetic rifles. It was the junior scribe, Jace, still carrying the empty leather case under his arm. His boots were dusty, his face pale from the thin air of the upper levels, but his hands were steady as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slate-gray cylinder. "The director has returned to the chamber," Jace said. His voice was small, but it carried clearly through the cold, dead air of the office. "He requested your presence for the final reading." Vian Zhao did not move. He stood behind his black desk, his towering height making the human look like a child in the doorway. The human delegation was dismissed by a legal vote of 9,112. You have no standing on the floor. Jace looked at the amber ledger stone sitting on the desk. He did not step inside the room. The floor is no longer counting votes, prime numerator. The director is waiting. The walk down the grand staircase of the spire was silent. The servants were gone, the indentured laborers already moving toward the transit platforms where the human pods were waiting. The great amphitheater of the celestial quorum, usually alive with the rustle of 3,000 delegates and the glare of 100 translation arrays, was cold and gray. A single emergency lantern sat on the iron table in the center of the floor, casting long, sharp shadows up into the empty tiers. Director Aris Kell sat in his chair, his hands flat on the metal surface. The iridium drafting compass lay between his palms, its legs closed, its point facing the high podium where Vian Zhao had stood during the morning session. He did not look up when the heavy, chitinous footsteps of the prime numerator echoed through the entrance arch. "The foundries took 14 minutes to clear," Kell said. He was looking at the compass, his thumb lightly touching the silver hinge. "The alloy is very pure. It crumbles cleanly when the frequency hits the core lattice. No secondary debris, no orbital clutter." Vian Zhao moved down the tier, his heavy mantle rustling against the stone seats. He stopped 3 paces from the iron table, his optical stalks lowering until they were level with the human's eyes. "You have destroyed our industrial base. You have left 300 systems without a defensive grid. The outer races will cross the border within a month. They won't cross, Kel said levelly. He finally looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the dim amber light of the single lantern. They were watching the sensors too. They saw 62 foundries disappear without a single kinetic shot. They are currently running their own numbers, prime numerator. They are figuring out what happens if they look at Earth the wrong way. He reached out, took the slate-gray urn from Jace, and set it on the center of the table. The sovereignty precept is now active, Kel said. We left your laborers alive so they could explain to you what actual power looks like. Now, we are going to update the ledger. Zal did not step toward the podium. He stood at the base of the lowest tier, his heavy chitinous chest drawing in the cold, unrefined air of the chamber. The single emergency lantern on the iron table cast his shadow high onto the empty seats behind him, a long black wedge that reached the top of the amphitheater. You have no authority to set a precept, Zal said. His voice was no longer a low hum. It was thin, the vibration broken by the dry rasp in his throat. The ledger stone remains on my desk. The legal record cannot be altered by a broadcast. Kel reached into his coat pocket. He did not pull out a document. He did not pull out a slate. He took out the small iridium drafting compass, turned it over once in his palm, and set it gently on the iron table. The steel point made a faint, clean click against the metal. For 40 years, every quorum inspector had watched human engineers use those same tools in the boundary shipyards. They had written them down in the archives as primitive manual instruments, the marks of a species that still calculated margins by hand because their processors lacked the core speed to simulate fields. The files had never been updated. The ledger had stayed static. The scribe has the new file, Kel said. He did not look at the compass. He looked at the slate-gray urn. We don't need a vote, prime numerator. The arithmetic is already finished. Jay stepped forward, his boots leaving dry gray footprints on the dark carpet. He did not open the leather case. He set it flat on the table, unbuckled the iron straps, and lifted a single page of clean white paper. It was thick, coarse pulp, completely free of circuit paths or copper threads. A single name was written at the top in black ink, Cradle 9. Below it, a single word had been stamped in red, Counted. The boarding team under Commander Trackvell has been reclassified, Jace read. His voice did not shake. They are no longer recorded as an active military unit. Their transport wedges have lost structural integrity. They are currently classified as orbital drift. Zal's hands flat against his thighs, his claws digging through the silk of his tunic until they touched the hard bone of his leg. He remembered the number. 300,000 soldiers were in the lower barracks when the grid died. They weren't dead. The human stealth ships hadn't fired a single kinetic slug into the living quarters, but the barracks were 3 miles beneath the canyon floor, and the transit lifts required core power to move the heavy hydraulic seals. The soldiers were locked in the dark. They had air, they had water, and they had 3 weeks of rations. But they had no ladders, no power, and no tools that could cut through 30 meters of unrefined silver iron without melting the bulkheads. You left them alive, Zal whispered. We are logistics officers, prime numerator, Kel said softly. He reached out and took the lid off the slate-gray urn. We don't waste material, we clear the yard. He picked up the urn with both hands. The container was heavy, the outer surface cool from the transit platform. He didn't look up at the tiers, and he didn't look at the high podium where the core lineages had sat for 3 generations. He turned the urn over, tilting the mouth down toward the center of the iron table. A stream of fine, dark gray powder poured from the opening. It didn't rush out like water, it slid slowly, a thick, heavy stream of metallic dust that gathered in a neat, perfect cone on the metal surface. There were no fragments in it. There were no gears, no wire leads, no scraps of silver mantle. The 62 orbital foundries, the great industrial engine that had built every wedge in the core fleet, had been reduced to an unbonded slurry of iron and carbon that took up less space than a cargo crate. The powder covered the iron table, spreading out until it touched the legs of the iridium drafting compass. "No fleets," Kell said. His voice was level, stripped of rhythm, striking the cold air like a hammer on stone. "No shipyards, no core." Vianzal stepped back, his multi-jointed knees locking as he looked at the gray cone. The dust didn't reflect the light of the lantern. It was completely flat, a dead spot in the center of the room that seemed to swallow the amber glow. "The sovereignty precept is very short," Kell said. He stood up from his chair, his dark coat falling straight against his boots. He did not raise his hand, and he did not look at the prime numerator's face. "Any lineage that designates another species as biological inventory forfeits the tools used to enforce the record. The files have been updated." He picked up the iridium compass, tucked it into his vest pocket, and turned toward the high obsidian doors. Jace followed him, the empty leather case held loosely by its strap. Their footsteps made a single, synchronized rhythm on the stone floor, moving away from the table, away from the lantern, away from the tier where the high representative of the Velorok stood alone in the gray light. Vianzal did not call for the guards. He did not look at his slate. He walked slowly to the table, reached out with his three-fingered hand, and touched the top of the gray cone. The powder was cold. It stuck to his skin, filling the fine lines between his chitinous plates with a dry, metallic grease that would not brush off. Outside, the purple storms of Tavan Prime had cleared, leaving the sky over the Great Canyon empty and dark. The long, black silhouette of the cinder ring was gone from the horizon. In its place, a single, wide band of gray dust drifted along the orbital arc, catching the faint light of the distant moons like a row of dead white teeth.